Delbert Tibbs, Kirk Bloodsworth, Randy Steidle, Anthony Graves, Juan Roberto Melendez Colon, and Henry Lee McCollum. All of these pictures can be found on the website for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. All of these men were sentenced to capital punishment and then exonerated. Wait, let me say that again. All of those men were convicted at first of a crime and then later set free because they were innocent. Why am I showing you pictures of their faces? Because it's important to put names to these cases and faces to these names. And unfortunately, these men only represent a number of cases of exonerations in the United States. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1973, 167 people in the United States have been released from death row with evidence of their innocence. And if those numbers aren't shocking and disgusting enough, let me further explain why the death penalty should be abolished in the United States. The first reason, and probably the most important reason, is because of human rights. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines human rights such as freedom from unlawful imprisonment, torture, and execution, regarded as belonging fundamentally to all persons. These human rights are basic and fundamental. These human rights are not conditional. We do not use the United States Constitution to say, if you are a good person and if you pay your taxes, then you have the right to life. In many cases recorded by Amnesty International, people were executed after being convicted in grossly unfair trials on the basis of torture-tainted evidence and with inadequate legal representation. Now, you may be thinking that this only happens in countries where there's a militant force or maybe even a dictatorship, and it does, but the United States government has already violated our constitutional rights. In the Supreme Court case of Furman versus Georgia in 1972, 3 cases of the death penalty were brought in front of the Supreme Court, and all 3 of them were found guilty of violating the 8th and 14th Amendments. And while the Supreme Court case did create stricter laws for the death penalty, it did not erase the injustices involved. Since the death penalty has been enforced, it has been used to discriminate against economic background, ethnicity, race, and religion. A case of discrimination against race tells us, from the Death Penalty Information Center tells us, in 96% of states where there have been reviews of race and the death penalty, there was a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination, or both. That's an example of race, but economic background also comes into play. Most of the people who are put onto death row cannot afford the legal costs for an attorney, so they are appointed one, and these people are appointed and paid through programs and limited funding. These limited funds mean that the defendants do not get adequate representation, and adequate representation is crucial. It can be the difference between life and death. And speaking of death, no matter how you word it, the capital punishment is murder. Humans are born with unalienable rights, and that includes the right to life. Even though the United States Constitution says that the death penalty is legal, it is not legal. It is murder. Now, I agree that it's important to use the correct terminology when talking about these cases, but no matter how you put it, the death penalty, lethal injection, execution, judicial execution, these are all ways of saying murder. And listen to this. The Roper versus Simmons case made it illegal for juveniles to be sentenced to death row, but this didn't even happen until 2005. And we know of at least 22 cases since the other Supreme Court case I told you about, Furman versus Georgia, of juveniles being sentenced. That means that 22 children were sentenced to death row before they could even drive a car or register to vote. We are allowing our government to murder people, and not only are we allowing them, we're paying for it. And the government continues to do it even though there are no statistics to back up the deterrence of crime because of the death penalty. There are lots of extra costs associated in cases with the death penalty, and although we don't have exact numbers because it varies state by state, we know that cases involving capital punishment cost at least twice as much. Why is it so expensive? Well, there are a lot of legal costs, like I told you before, with attorneys. There are lots of costs associated with stuff before the trial even starts. DNA forensic testing, and because mental health patients cannot be put on death row, mental health and background checks have to be conducted. It's a long process for the jury to be selected, and it's also a long process for the actual case to be determined. It's actually 4 times as longer than a normal case not involving capital punishment. Incarceration rates begin to soar when you put a defendant into solitary confinement and you have to pay for extra security and scheduling. And every time a defendant uses the right to an appeal, the taxpayers are paying it. And these appeals are used to try and minimize mistakes in cases. And because those appeals happen, they do minimize mistakes, but they do not actually erase them. Humans are involved in the death penalty, and because of that, we can never be 100% sure, and anything less than 100% is unacceptable, especially because the death penalty convictions can be based on witness testimonies, and this was actually the case with Delbert Tibbs. The victim in the case of Delbert Tibbs had previously identified the perpetrator as someone with dark skin and an afro, and Delbert Tibbs was stopped and arrested, and the victim actually changed her mind and accused Delbert Tibbs of being the perpetrator, even though he did not match any of the description of what she previously gave. Another case of a witness testimony gone awry is in the spy trials. The spy trials were cases based on paranoia and hysteria of communism. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted in 1951 of conspiracy to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And their main accuser was actually Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. In the textbook, Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner, Foner says that the evidence used against Julius was actually top secret information, so it wasn't revealed at the time. But when it was later revealed, it did not have enough evidence to convict Julius of the death penalty. And initially, there was almost no evidence of Ethel being guilty, but she was sentenced to death along with her husband Julius in 1953. Now, here is where the case gets even crazier. David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, the main accuser, was later recorded saying that he lied about some of the testimony that involved Ethel. Now, after a few years in prison, David got out and he was able to live into his 90s. But Ethel never got that chance, because death is final and irreversible. Now, DNA technology is continuing to advance, and it's helped us determine the guilt and innocence of people in multiple crimes. But we do not have the technology to bring someone back from life. Once someone is killed, they cannot come back. So we try everything we can to minimize mistakes. And the Death Penalty Information Center says, to minimize mistakes, every prisoner is entitled to a series of appeals. These appeals are essential because some inmates have come within hours of execution before evidence was uncovered proving their innocence. Imagine waking up in solitary confinement the morning that you're supposed to be executed for a crime that you know you didn't commit, and the amount of relief that you feel when hours before your execution evidence comes up that you're innocent. Now, I said that convictions aren't 100%, but not only are they not perfect, there's actually a margin of 4%. According to PNAS, We use survival analysis to model this effect and estimate that if all death sentence defendants remained under sentence of death indefinitely, at least 4.1% would be exonerated. We conclude that this is a conservative estimate of the proportion of false conviction among death sentences in the United States. That means 4 out of every 100 people are wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death row. Now that you've heard the case against the death penalty, how there's a 4% margin of error, it's a violation of human rights, that it's taxpayer funded, that it's discriminatory, and that it does not deter people from committing crimes. Let's go back to the pictures I showed you in the very beginning. Delbert spent 2 years on death row. Kirk spent a total of 9 years in prison, 2 of those being on death row. Randy spent a total of 17 years in prison, and 12 of those were on death row. Anthony spent 18 and a half years in prison, and 16 of those were in solitary confinement, and 12 of them were on death row. Juan spent nearly 18 years on death row, and Henry spent 3 decades on death row. Now, it may seem like I'm just throwing a bunch of numbers at you and it all seems very redundant, but it's important to put names to these cases and faces to these names. Although these men have been allowed to walk free, this has determined and affected their whole life. It's important to know about these cases. It's important to know that the United States is the only country in the Americas that allows the death penalty. It's important to know that 5 people this year, 2020, have already been executed, and 2 of them were right here in the state of Texas. Killing somebody because they killed somebody will not bring the victim back, and it's a violation of human rights. Whether they are guilty or innocent, they deserve the right to life, and the death penalty should be abolished.